First century culture. There are some things about first century culture that are really hard to swallow, or to even accept, or to even tolerate. One of those things is this wonderful thing we call slavery. Now, we're going to dive in a little more deeply into this passage today to kind of unpack some things to look at. So, how does it feel to think of the idea of Jesus saying that we should think of ourselves as worthless slaves, only doing what we're commanded, and that we should not look for accolades for doing what we were commanded? Anybody get a little upset with that? A little offended? Maybe having trouble wanting to follow Jesus if this is what Jesus teaches us? Well, good news. According to the Jesus Seminar, which I'm inclined to take very seriously, all the scholars pretty much agree that these were words put into Jesus' mouth by the author of the Gospel of Luke. Now we're going to go even further into generosity with these wonderful big words we call exegesis and hermeneutics. Yeah. Things you learn in seminary that I wish more people knew. So, exegesis is where you explore the text, try to figure out what's going on in the text, its historical context. Who was the author? Who was the intended audience? What were they trying to accomplish? What was their perspective on the world when they were writing these things? So basically just trying to figure out what's really going on underneath the surface at face value. And then the fun word hermeneutics, which is a weird word because it comes from the god Hermes, but anyway, he was a messenger, is how you interpret what's going on. So depending on how you try to make sense of it determines how you understand what it says and how to apply it, accept it, dismiss it, wrestle with it, etc., etc. So, first things first, we have to understand the difference between 2,000 years and thousands of miles. First century Rome was a slave economy. That does not mean we have to accept it. It does not mean we have to like it or approve of it. But we need to suspend for just a minute our 21st century sensibilities and at least try to understand what is going on in this spot. So, it didn't matter where you were in the world, slavery was a reality. People who were conquered were taken as slaves. People were bought and sold. People who were slaves owned other slaves. And sometimes it was more profitable to be a slave than to be a free person in ancient Rome. In fact, oftentimes the worst thing that could happen to a slave was to be freed as an elder by their master, because they were guaranteed to not have any means of taking care of themselves. And if you were the slave of the emperor, for example, you had exponentially more power than Jesus or any other freed person who was a peasant. Now, when we think of slavery, we often think of chattel slavery that happened in Africa by Western European empires, which is a slightly different flavor from first century slavery. It doesn't mean that it's better, it's different. It wasn't based on skin color or kidnapping people from a particular area. It had to do with status, it had to do with nationality, it had to do with being a conquered nation, things along these lines. So already we have a very, very, very different world. And keep in mind, the Jewish people did not condemn slavery. Even though they were liberated from slavery into the promised land, slavery was still part of even their own economy. So even in our own scriptures, there is argumentation for that. And that's part of why we had the issues that we had in the 1800s and the early 1900s in this country, where people took those passages and justified great evils in the name of our Jesus. So, now that we've dealt with that uncomfortable fact, and by uncomfortable, I mean awful. What the heck? Why are we putting these two passages together? This is another week where we're dealing with two very seemingly disparate things put together. Now, you might wonder why I tend to agree with the scholars that Jesus did not say this. Well, 5 verses before, Jesus was talking, the narrator says the disciples were talking to Jesus. But in this passage, notice that it is a different word, apostles. Now, apostle means one sent. Disciple means follower of. The apostles were the ones that were commissioned by Jesus after his resurrection to go out into the world. So we're kind of putting things that are a little bit later in the timeline backwards into this setting in order to make it work. Increase our faith, Jesus. Give us more faith. And Jesus said, hello? If you had faith the size of a mustard seed, and those of you who have seen mustard seeds, you know that they're tiny. You could do these great things. It reminds me of when I was desperately anxious and afraid when I was younger. I went to my mom asking her what to do in a situation. Like, how am I going to do this thing? How am I going to have the courage to step into this decision I make that no matter what is going to be hard? She's like, you just do it. I'm like, that doesn't help me. That just makes it worse. She's like, I don't know what else to say. You just have to do it. It also reminds me, as I recently watched the Star Wars trilogy, the scene in The Empire Strikes Back, which you probably know, where Luke Skywalker's TIE fighter is sunk into the swamp. And he's like, there's no way I'm going to do this. He's like, you can do it. And Luke says, all right, I'll give it a try. And Yoda says, try not. Either do or do not. There is no try. And Luke looked at him like, seriously, dude, come on. And so he tries. He gets a little ways, and Yoda's like, be still my heart. He might actually start believing in himself. And then he goes right back into the swamp. And he's just like, walks off, and Yoda does this thing where he's like, okay, I'm a Zen master, basically. Uses the Force, gets the whole thing and places it down. And Luke says, I don't believe it. And Yoda says, that is why you fail. That is why you fail. You don't believe it. Now I want to flip that a little bit here. I don't think that faith is a belief. Faith is an action. Faith cannot happen unless there is a possibility of it not working out. There is no assurance in faith. It is a risk. And only when we faith, as it were, do we begin to see how our belief can be transformed by that risk, by that challenge, by that faith. Does that seem kind of weird, or does that make sense to you? A little bit of both, maybe? Bless you. Excuse me. You're good. So, stripping away the horribleness of slavery, let's look at, say you have a job and you have a task to do. Let's put it in our context. We go to our work, we do our job. Do we expect to be praised and given special treatment for doing what we've been hired to do? No, we do the job because it's what we're hired to do. Well said, buddy. And so, if we were to actually increase our faith, we would have to do the job that we are called to do. So the challenge that we face in the story, aside from first century politics, is how do we increase our faith rather than asking God to do it for us? Because again, the apostles were asking for Jesus to do that for them. If you'll just give me, if you can just give me faith, then I can go out and do the work. Jesus says, no. Go out and do the work, and you will increase your faith. Well, what is the work? What is the job? Well, in the fullness of the story of Jesus, it's building the kingdom of heaven. How many of you have been afraid to do what you feel called by God to do in your life? Raise your hand. I know I have. Okay. What makes you afraid to do these things?
Fear of failure.
Fear of failure?
It's gonna hurt.
It's going to hurt.
It might be too much work.
It might be too much work. Sorry?
What would Dad think?
Oh, what would Dad think? Well, 9 times out of 10, I'm going to put money on your dad would be cool with whatever you do if it's really what God wants you to build the kingdom of love in the world. So, and that 1/10 time, we can have a conversation, but I'm pretty sure you're good to go on all 10. For me, fear of rejection, fear of appearing like a superstitious git or a fool. So, or even more, oh dear God, what is this going to do to change my world forever if I take this choice? Like, I don't know, becoming a priest. I don't know, getting engaged. I don't know, choosing to trust that God's going to land me a job by doing whatever I can to get there. Or, I don't know, figuring out how to pivot when we have a pandemic going on. Or how do I make amends for when I make mistakes? So, the ultimate question that today is asking us, which is akin to the story of St. Francis, who did a fundamental life shift, is what are we being called to do, of which we are afraid, of which we don't have enough faith currently to be able to accomplish? And when we do that, rather than hoping that we have enough faith to do that beforehand, what will God teach us in our faith as a result of the doing? Instead of the, okay, I can believe this, I've got this, no problem. It's, God, I have no idea how this is going to work. This is something that is beyond what I can do on my own, and you're asking me to do it. This is what I'm hoping for. This is what you're inviting me into. I need you to help me do this, but I'm going to do it and then see what comes out the other side. That, I think, is a lot of what we're facing in terms of how do we pivot? How do we set up a new normal? How do we grow this congregation? How do we be what this congregation needs to be in Fremont? How do we build God's kingdom here and now? Well, there are maybe a few things here and there that we might be afraid of doing, which is natural. There might be questions that we're afraid of asking, much less even answering. And that's normal. But what's interesting to me is I notice that every time we do what we're asked to do in our faith increases. Our community grows. We grow as individuals. God's kingdom gets built more and more. So just as Francis had the courage to do the wildness of, all right, Dad, I'm done with your riches. I'm going to strip out of all my clothes and walk out of the city and follow itineracy, follow what God has called me to do, and do so much amazing work that we now celebrate his Sunday every year and utilize him. And his name is the namesake of our bay. What is God saying? This is what you need to do, that you're afraid to do, or you don't have enough faith to do, that were you to do it, and then find out why you could or could not do it afterwards, will increase your faith, and even more, increase God's kingdom here. Whether it be your own life, whether it be this church, whether it be in the Tri-City area, Hayward, the Bay Area. May we have courage to take that leap out into what seems like an abyss, to find that ledge that only after we have stepped out, we discover. And make our way across and do what we are meant to do. Amen.